I'm delighted to introduce the speaker for this webinar. The speaker for this webinar is Daniel Hargreaves. Just a brief introduction about Daniel Hargreaves. Daniel rescued his first bat when he was 7 years old and has been fascinated by bats ever since. Daniel has also been involved with numerous global bat conservation projects, working with a wide range of species and helping to develop conservation initiatives in many countries, including Trinidad, Thailand, and Zambia. He was also awarded the BCT's Pete August Award in 2012 for inspiring others and making an outstanding practical contribution to bat conservation. Daniel now works full-time in bat conservation as bat program manager for the Vincent Wildlife Trust. With that introduction, I want to stop sharing my screen and hand over the stage to Daniel Hargreaves.
Yes, thank you for the warm introduction, and it's so great to be able to speak to so many people from a global perspective as well. Looking in the chat, there's people from all over the world, which is brilliant, and many countries that I haven't visited yet. So I look forward perhaps to collaborating further with many of you in the audience. I can also see a few friends and people that I've worked with in the audience as well. So hello. Yeah, I'd like to just thank Bats Without Borders for asking me to speak. Those that know me will know I don't need a reason to talk about bats. I pretty much talk about bats all the time. So to have a captive audience for the next 45 minutes, 50 minutes is brilliant for me. I've got an awful lot to cover because when Rachel asked me to speak, she said, could I talk about sort of my journey through bat conservation and some of the projects that I've been working on and collaborating with people on. And it's actually really difficult to get that amount of information across within 45 minutes. So I've just selected a few elements of the projects that I've been working on, and would also like to talk about a few of my favourite species. As Christopher already introduced me, I don't really need to say a great deal, but I've been involved with bats since a very early age. Just picture in the top left of the screen is me when I was 3 years old, and my Christmas present that year was a Batman costume. So I guess bats have always been within my DNA. And then when I was slightly older, 7 years old, I did a school project on bats, and I got absolutely fascinated by them and was intrigued by their unique sort of ecology and the diversity of bats. And that same year, I rescued a common pipistrelle bat, a small bat that we have here in the UK. I rescued it and somebody looked after it for a couple of days, and then we went back to the place it was rescued and released it. And I became infatuated with bats. And for the next few years, as a kid, I would read any literature I could find on bats, which was very few and far between in the 80s. There weren't many bat books at all. But there was one book in particular, which was called Which Bat Is It? By Bob Stebbins. And this used to be like my little Bible. I would read that from cover to cover, and I would know everything about how to identify bats in the UK. And then occasionally you might see a bat on the television, and I had bats zooming around in my garden that I could enjoy as well. Bats at the time, it wasn't really a career path that you could move into. I wasn't ever able to see that I could work with bats full time, and I got interested in other things, and spent a lot of time in my teenage years in the countryside, interested in fishing and lots of other different animals. And then in my late teens, I came back to bats, and I moved down to London, and I needed something to do to occupy my spare time. And I got really interested in bat ecology and volunteering with many bat groups. And in my early 20s, I spent a lot of time with the Hearts of Middlesex Bat Group, the Wiltshire Bat Group, and the Essex Bat Group in the UK. And I was basically training for a bat license, and it was all purely voluntary, but I would get involved with things like bat care, bat rehabilitation, bat surveys, going out and doing monitoring projects with the bat groups, and then slightly more advanced projects like radio tracking and catching and investigating bats. And then in my sort of mid-20s, late 20s, I got the opportunity to travel to see bats, and I went to Honduras for 3 months as part of a project with Operation Wallacea. And I spent 3 months looking at bats in a cloud forest in Honduras, going out every day, mist netting, catching bats, identifying them, collecting biometric data and feeding that back to the scientists at Operation Wallacea. And that was brilliant. That sparked absolute fascination with me, not just in the bats that we found there, but in traveling and spending more times overseas. And over the next few years, I got to spend more and more time working in lots of different countries. And many people might recognize my name from bat photography, and a lot of people consider me as a bat photographer, but I don't. Bat photography came much later for me. I'm actually a bat conservationist at heart, and photography is something I've developed over time. And for people that have known me for a long time will know I used to be very active on social media, and in particular on YouTube, and putting lots of different bat videos out there. And I spent a long time using infrared and night vision cameras before they really became out and became a necessity as they are today in the UK. But in the mid-2000s, I was using infrared cameras and documenting unique bat behaviour. And then the photography really came or developed through a meeting with Merlin Tuttle. And in 2012, I got to work with Merlin Tuttle for the first time. And Merlin, to me, had always been an inspiration, somebody that I'd wanted to work with for a number of years. And when I was 30 in 2011, my wife wrote to him and said that you and Daniel should work together. You'd be a great partnership. So Merlin sent me a very nice birthday card and a framed photograph of one of my favourite species. And we had a chat, and Merlin had a number of species he wanted to photograph, and many of them were in Thailand, and that happened to be a place that I was working in at the time. And we got together in 2012, and Merlin taught me how to do bat photography. I was basically his assistant for the best part of a month in Thailand. And this picture is us coming out of a cave, and I'm absolutely covered in guano and bat urine because I was stood underneath a colony of almost 1 million bats for a few hours while Merlin was taking photographs. But it was great because I learned an awful lot. And hopefully in this talk, I can share some of the photographs that I've taken with you as part of the talk and tell you about some of the species I've been fortunate enough to work on. Many people often ask about my favourite bat species, and you know, it's a bit like asking somebody about their favourite child. You're not allowed to have favourites, but I do have a few favourites. But I checked this morning, there's 1,469 bat species currently listed globally, so it's very difficult to pick a favourite. But I think for me, I'm sort of fascinated by lots of species, even the most common ones like the common pipistrelle, the first bat that I actually handled. I'm still fascinated by these species, but more so some of the more exotic ones, some of the flying foxes. You know, they're incredibly cute to look at. Some of the more colourful bats, like the northern ghost bat, pictured here from Costa Rica, and some of the small fruit-eating bats from Central and South America are just stunning bats to look at, and are often one of my favourites. But I often like things that are unique, like the slip-face bats. This one was taken in Zambia. It's got this weird nose with a slit right down the centre of its face, and we're slightly unsure about why that's there. But it's not the only bat to have a peculiar nose. Loncarina aurita, this was taken in Trinidad. The sword-nosed bat is absolutely bizarre and fascinating to me. And sometimes the uglier bats get, the more interesting they get. And this Mormoops from Central America is a good example of that. And if we think about conservation, I think some of the cuter bats are the easiest ones to talk about, and ones that have got long tongues, like this long tongue bat, is they look rather cheeky, blowing a raspberry over time that you handle them. I guess you could say small is cute, and I've been lucky enough to work on the bumblebee bat, or work with bumblebee bats in Thailand. And these are incredibly tiny animals, weighing 1.9 to 2.5 grams, a forearm of about 25 mil. So you're talking, you know, literally the top of your thumb is the size of a bumblebee bat, often difficult to demonstrate in pictures. But yeah, definitely one of my favorites. But I also really like the sort of loud and obnoxious bats that we find. And one of them is the bulldog bat, Noctilio leperinus. And that produces a call over 140 decibels, which is louder than most mammals, not as loud as some of the whales, but certainly some of the terrestrial land mammals, louder than howler monkeys, for example. It's quite incredible that they produce these sounds. And it's called the bulldog bat because of this unique cheeks structure that they have around their face. They've got these flabby cheeks, which represent the bulldog. And these cheeks really come into their own when they've actually caught fish. And you'll see in this picture from Trinidad, this is a fishing bat, a bulldog bat, and it's been out feeding, it's caught fish, and it's chopped them up into small pieces and filled its cheek pouches full of bits of fish. So they're absolutely fascinating. They've got huge legs, huge claws that they use to gaff fish from the surface of water. And I'm just going to show you a short video because I was very lucky last year to be working with bulldog bats in Trinidad, and this video was actually taken on an iPhone, but you'll see a bat come out of the shadows, hopefully, and catch a fish, which is just incredible to think. I used to go fishing when I was a child, and the fact that bats can go fishing at night is just mind-boggling. Some species are slightly more difficult to have a favourite or to conserve, and wrinkle-faced bats are actually one of my favourite bats. Not everybody's favourite for obvious reasons, but to me, I just think they're amazing. You know, they're so ugly that they're cute, and it's a fascinating species. But some bats do us a favour by being incredibly cute and showing off. And often the Honduran tent bat, which is a species that I've seen in Costa Rica, is an amazing bat. It looks like a marshmallow with wings, and they bite the midrib of leaves to create a tent inside, and you can see this colony hiding away, yellow fur, white wings, but when they fly, white fur and yellow ears and nose leaf, and then black wings. When they fly out of the leaf, they have this stunning coloration, which is quite amazing. So it's really difficult to pick a favorite, but if I have a species that I like to return to and work on, it always seems to be the painted bat, Kerivula picta, which is just amazing and fascinating. It's a species I've worked on in Thailand, and when I first met these, it was in the mid-2000s, and I visited a place in northeast Thailand, and it was a village. It's an agricultural area up in Khon Kaen province, and I learned that the farmers there were catching some of these bats, and they would feed them to their fighting chickens in the belief that it would give them strength and power to fight, which is, you know, it's bizarre to think that people were doing this in times gone by. And more recently, it's really worrying about painted bats, that you can buy them online for very little money. I've seen them for as little as $20, and we're not sure of the exact origin, but seem to originate out of Java and Vietnam and Laos, Cambodia. And it's sad that a species so beautiful can be persecuted like this, and not a lot is done about it. But I can happily say that in the area of Thailand where we found them, there's lots of conservation work and a really good initiative started by my colleagues, pictured here in the top left, Yi Kwang and Pong Sanon. They set up a little bit of ecotourism in this part of Thailand, and the idea was, if they support the farmers that were managing the land and show that there was a true benefit to these bats, then that might encourage them to conserve them. So I started visiting there mid-2000s and been going not every year, but almost every other year, and encouraging other people to visit this area. And we've been working with a family, and every time we go, we help support that family by providing a little bit of income, but also a little bit of support to give them a benefit from having the bats on their land. And Peter Nom, who's the head farmer, here he is holding a leaf, actually conserves these bats. He goes out every day and is planting banana trees, which is where these bats typically prefer to roost. And he breaks the end of the leaf, as you can see on the right-hand side, and that creates a part of a dead leaf, which the painted bats like to use. And here you can see a male and a female roosting in a dead banana leaf. And these bats are quite unique. They roost in pairs, which is quite unusual for bats. They don't roost in large colonies. So here you've got an adult male, an adult female, and they will have 1 or 2 pups during the year. So occasionally you'll see 3 or 4 bats together. And for a long time, we thought perhaps the adults were paired for life. They were like a mated pair, but since then, ringing studies have shown that they typically pair up for between 1 and 3 years, and then they change partners. But it's quite unique. They're almost roosting like, or nesting like birds do, where they roost in these small family groups. And once you've found a pair, you then need to move about 1 kilometre, 1.5 kilometres before you find the next pair. And they move on and on. We're not sure why they have this unique coloration. It's perhaps mimicking. We've noticed that if they're disturbed during the day and they fly, they flop around a little bit like butterflies, and they sort of resemble butterflies. But actually, if you radio track them at night, they're actually quite quick on the wing and they move around a lot faster. So perhaps that unique coloration is a mimic. It's been great to be actively involved with a conservation project, and it's not difficult to get people to enthuse about painted bats. It's a beautiful animal, and we've gone out each year, planted more and more bananas, and taken people to see some of these bats in the village. And the colonies seem to be doing really well there, and the family is very well supported. From the money that we've raised from people coming to see them, we've managed to buy equipment for the farm and things like sewing machines, so we can create extra income for the people that are managing the land there, and just taking people out to interact with these communities that are often closed off. It's not a touristy area, so it's really good to be able to take people out and do some active conservation. And working on a beautiful species like painted bat makes it a lot easier. Some of the species of bats are slightly more difficult to get people to love, and I think a lot of that is down to their unique habits. And this is a picture of a common vampire bat, and it can look quite cute, but the fact that it drinks blood is what deters a lot of people. And vampire bats, as many people know, are only found in Central and South America. And to bat workers, they're absolutely fascinating. I spent my childhood dreaming about meeting vampire bats, and I've been lucky enough in my adult years to meet all 3 species that we have. So we have the common vampire bat, the white-winged vampire bat, and the hairy-legged vampire. And you know, they're unique really as mammals, that they solely exist on drinking blood. And the common vampire bat sort of specializes on mammals, but can also drink bird blood. But the white-winged and hairy-legged vampires, they pretty much prefer bird blood, although if needed, they can drink mammalian blood. And here's a short video of a common vampire, just proving us wrong that it's not just about mammals. They do feed on chickens. And I was thinking, really, if I was the prey item for a bat, I'd rather get a kiss from a vampire bat than I would from perhaps a carnivorous bat. Because at least with a vampire bat, the prey survives. It's very rare that they kill their host, because they're only drinking a relatively small amount of blood. Whereas if you were the prey item of a carnivorous bat, then your fate is much worse. And we have a number of carnivorous bats around the world, and I've been lucky to see a couple in Asia, but one that I got to work on was in Trinidad. was the Vampirum spectrum, and you can see my colleague here holding a Vampirum spectrum. And we managed to radio track a couple of individuals and follow them back to their roosts. And one of them roosts was in a tree. And there's a video on YouTube. I'm not going to play it to you now because we don't have much time, but there's a video on YouTube of showing this tree and the behavior that was going on inside it. And it was quite amazing, really. It was a hollow tree that we could actually watch the bats from the ground using night vision cameras. We could see inside the hollow, and we documented lots of unique behavior, including the bats bringing rodents, mice and birds back and feeding their young with them. So when we think about ecology of bats, it's just fascinating to think that we've got all these different species, some that are living their life consuming blood, other ones that are carnivorous. And I think that's what interests me the most about many of these bats. And I was very lucky in 2009 to visit Trinidad and Tobago and work with some of these bats. It was actually on a bat conservation international trip. And I visited Trinidad and learned a lot about the different bat species that were there. We got to meet over 20 species, which is quite amazing. And it's the first time I got to see fishing bats and some of the fruit bats and some of the carnivorous bats that are there, and vampire bats as well. It was a really unique experience. And while I was there, we were looking at things like the legislation. And at the time, this was the legislation in Trinidad, and all bats were listed as vermin. And if you had land, you could easily hunt and destroy. And right at the top of the list was bats, and they weren't even recognized as different species. A bat was a bat in Trinidad. And I was speaking to the trip leader, Jeffrey Gomes, and he said, yeah, people just are not interested. There's been a lot of bat research done in Trinidad from visiting scientists. They would visit the island, they would do research, and then they would leave with that work. And there was very little conservation happening on the ground. So Jeffrey was a bit of a lone voice for a while. There was other people working on bats in Trinidad, but Jeffrey was sort of a lone voice and really wanted to promote the bats of Trinidad and how amazing the diversity was, and that they shouldn't be listed as vermin. So we started working together, and we collaborated on a project, and we founded the NGO, which is now known as Trinibats. And at the same time, we started to co-op other members, Darshan here and Luke, and a lady called Janine that you'll see in a picture shortly. And as a way to fund this, we decided to do ecotourism, or do these expeditions. So for several years, we would invite people to come out to Trinidad and spend a week working on all these wonderful bats, doing research, doing conservation. And that enabled Jeffrey then to write a book about the bats of Trinidad and Tobago. And he co-authored this with Fiona, and Fiona Reid is a wildlife artist and a brilliant bat person as well. And they wrote a brilliant book all about the bats of Trinidad and Tobago. Jeffrey created a great Facebook page, and we built a website. And also importantly, he wrote a letter to the minister to perhaps ask them to consider changing legislation to protect bats. And several years later, that came out in, I think it was 2015, 2016, we got notified that the legislation was changed, and all bats other than vampire bats were removed from the vermin list and became protected, which was a real success to the end of quite a long campaign about the bats of Trinidad. And it's a place I'd love to revisit, and we may revisit in the future. But after sort of spending several years going back each year, it was brilliant to see how conservation in Trinidad has changed over time. But protection doesn't necessarily mean that the bats are going to be conserved. And I think it sort of highlights that legislation is important, but actively going out and researching some of these bats is equally as important. And back home in the UK, if we look at the mammal report from 2018, you know, we have far fewer bats than Trinidad, but still bats are among the least understood British mammals. And we couldn't do any population estimates because of a lack of data for these. So it's, my mind boggles to think that in Trinidad, when I first went, there was a handful of people that were interested in bats and conservation. In the UK, we have literally thousands of volunteers and professional ecologists and researchers and universities working on bats, and we still don't know an awful lot about many of the species. We've only got 17 breeding species, and one of the species that I've worked on is a migratory bat called the Nephusius pipistrelle. And I started working on this species in 2009. And I set up a national project called the National Nephusius Pipistrelle Project. And that was really on the back of a lack of data for this species. And if we look at this bat migration in Europe, a review of banding data, which was published in 2003, there was basically no records or no evidence of bats flying into the UK, but we knew that they were migrating from different areas within Europe. And we had signs that bats were possibly migrating here because they'd been found on oil rigs, they had been found on the coast, but we had no direct evidence. So I teamed up with the Bat Conservation Trust and we came up with a National Nephusius Pipistrelle project. And really it had two aims. One was to look at if the bats were resident and breeding in Great Britain, but also to work out if they were migrating here, where were they coming from and how far would they travel. And our first task really was to work out how to catch the species, because they were quite difficult. There wasn't many in the hand records at the time. Just over 100 bats had been caught in the hand or seen in the hand since records began, over 50 years. So we needed to develop a way to catch them. And also because it was a species that could range and cover long distances, there was little point trying to do this on our own. So we decided to come up with a community science project and get lots of bat groups involved in the UK. And we did this project over a number of years, and some of the groups are still running the project. And it's sort of been rolled out to Wales and to Scotland as well, because it concentrated on England in the first few years. But what it did, it taught us a lot about Nephusius pipistrelles. We were amazed how far they would migrate. When we initially did the science, we were doing stable isotope, where we were measuring isotopes within the bat's fur, and the evidence came back the results came back showing that the bats perhaps were migrating from as far away as Russia. And we didn't really believe the science at the time. We thought, no, it seems a little bit far for a tiny bat. This bat only weighs about 7 grams. It's quite small. And for it to be traveling that far was almost unbelievable. But actually now we've had several records of bats flying as far away as Russia. And we think they're doing this annual migration into the UK. And the UK seems to be a stopover site where we have lots and lots of males in the UK, and we have an influx of females towards autumn, and then them females are perhaps migrating back in spring, and perhaps the UK is quite an important site for mating. We find lots of individuals that are advertising for females that are looking for mates, which is great. We've also found some maternity colonies, but the ones we've found have been very transient and have moved around quite a lot. And when I started this project, it was interesting because I think these small brown bats, people often overlook because it's seen as perhaps a common species, then perhaps they don't get the attention that they deserve. And I often like to highlight the decline of the Christmas Island pipistrelle in Australia, where it was widespread and common in the 80s, and then 30 years later, sadly, it was extinct. And I think we've really got to be thinking about some of these commoner bats that we see. We shouldn't always concentrate on rare bats. We should think about the common ones, and especially those that migrate to areas, because a little bit like the straw-coloured fruit bat in Zambia, any bat that's migrating to an area, it's very difficult to conserve because you're working over such a huge scale. And I was very fortunate to visit Kasanka in 2015 with Helen from Zambats, and it was one of the first projects out there looking at all the bats in Zambia, not just the fruit bats. But we were lucky to visit Kasanka, and we got to go into the bat forest, and I was very happy to see that it was protected and there was no access. It was really difficult for anybody, including bat conservationists, to get in there. And it's really great to see that this area is protected. But then just a couple of years ago, it became under threat from development. And, you know, we can protect small areas, but protecting migratory routes is incredibly difficult. And last year, I found myself back at Kasanka running a trip with Merlin Tuttle's Bat Conservation, MTBC, and we were back at Kasanka just trying to support some more work, some outreach. And Merlin's organisation has developed a video about the plight of the bats at Kasanka and the risks that they face, which will hopefully go on to help some of the active conservation. And it's not just about the fruit bats that are there. There are other bats present in Kasanka, and one of my favourites from the last trip was this small woolly bat that we found, and they roost in bird nests, which is amazing. So, you know, whilst you've got millions of fruit bats flying around you, these small insectivorous bats that we hardly know anything about that are out there in the ecosystem as well. I think anywhere where there's bats in numbers is going to be a conservation target, and one of them is Khao Chang Pran in Thailand. This is a large cave. It's got millions of insectivorous bats in there. It's the home of the wrinkle-lip bat, this tiny little individual. And if you're there at dawn, you'll see bats returning to the cave, and this picture just illustrates the numbers, you know, hundreds of thousands of bats returning. And the black that you can see on the roof or the ceiling of this cave is all bats squashed in, literally millions and millions of bats, or hundreds of thousands of bats flying back in. We've never actually done an accurate count on this colony, but you can imagine with that amount of bats, the amount of guano that's produced. And a real benefit of these bats is that this guano is worth a lot of money to the local community, and it generates tens of thousands of pounds a year with people going in and collecting the guano sustainably and selling it to for agriculture, which is great. It really shows a benefit to having the bats. And another benefit is tourism, and Khao Chang Pran is set up for ecotourism, for people to come and enjoy the bats. And it's built around there's a monastery built around the cave, and it's very well protected. But again, we're not sure how far these bats range and about wider protection within the landscape. But you know, it's a really good place to visit. And during COVID, it had some other visitors that perhaps weren't there for tourism, or perhaps not for conservation. And to me, this really highlighted that bat conservation is ongoing. We can't just visit a place and then not return. We've got to keep supporting these communities and these unique places for the bats, because you know, just the year before, we were taking pictures of people enjoying the bats and seeing them flying out, and then a year later people were going in hazmat suits in a place where people have been visiting for probably well over 100 years, going in and collecting the guano with no PPE, and all of a sudden you've got virologists going in, perhaps painting a completely different picture about bats. And I think COVID was a tough time, and for me personally, it was a tough time. I got COVID really early on and was quite ill with it, but also it grounded me. There was a couple of years where I couldn't travel anywhere, and I was sat at home contemplating what to do. And many people were surprised that up until this point, 2022, all of my bat work was voluntary. I wasn't paid for any of it. It was purely a passion project. All of the projects that I'd done globally were purely a passion project. And then all of a sudden I couldn't travel. I couldn't do some of the conservation projects I'd been working on. And I was at home thinking, okay, what shall I do for my future? I need to be doing more in bat conservation. I need to change my career, which wasn't in bats at all. And I was thinking about going solo and perhaps doing my own bat conservation efforts. And then I was contacted by the BBC, and they wanted to work on some species for a natural history unit programme, a sort of flagship program that's going to be on the screens next year. And I got offered a short-term contract working with the BBC. So I took that on. And then shortly after that, the Vincent Wildlife Trust advertised for a bat program manager. And I thought, wow, this is an opportunity for me to do full-time practical bat conservation, something that I'd relish. And I'd been a fan of the Vincent Wildlife Trust for a number of years. So I was incredibly fortunate to be interviewed, shortlisted, and accepted for the position. And now I'm the bat program manager for the trust. And for those people that don't know us, we're a small NGO based in the UK, but we work within Europe. And it was established almost 50 years ago. And it's a very small team, 20 staff. And we focus our work on rare mammals, and in particular, small carnivores and some of the rarer bat species. And these are the mammals that we work on. And you'll recognise that there's several bats: greater horseshoe, lesser horseshoe, barber-style, Bechsteins, and Mediterranean are species that we're working on over time as principal species. But we also have species that we're working on, and we're not sure yet about what we need to do for their conservation, or how we can help them. And then we have a couple of species that we are watching and think we'll be working on in the future. And it's a real privilege for me to be able to work for an organisation that's got a really long history of being actively involved with practical conservation, and the likes of Henry Schofield and Colin Morris and a few others that have been involved with the trust through its years. And we have lots of different projects. I can't speak a lot about them today, but one of them, or two of them, is our long-term ringing projects on barber-stells and Bechstein's bats. And if you listen to the podcast Bat Chat, then you'll hear a recent episode all about our work on Bechstein's bats down in Dorset. And in the future, you'll be able to hear about our work on barber-stell bats as well. But probably what we're most famous for is our bat reserves. And we manage nearly 40 bat reserves. And when we say a bat reserve, this is a building, a series of buildings, a church, a cave that has a bat colony in there. And they're spread throughout Ireland, the west coast of Ireland, and Wales and England. And we manage these purely for bats. And our tenants are the horseshoe bats, greater horseshoes and lesser horseshoes. You can see the size difference here in this image. And we have an awful lot of responsibility, because on our reserves, in particular for greater horseshoe bats, we have over 50% of the UK population. And for lesser horseshoes, slightly less, but in Ireland, almost a third of the population are at home on our reserves. So we have a lot of responsibility for the species. And we have two of the largest colonies found in Europe. We have a colony of lesser horseshoes with 1,500 animals there, and greater horseshoes with 2,500 at a site down in Devon. And these really came around from in the early days at VWT. They would identify buildings that had perhaps important bat colonies, and these buildings would be refurbished. This is Hendra Cottage. So it got refurbished into a bat reserve. And then gradually over time, we manage these reserves, manage the habitat around them, and promote them for bat conservation. And internally inside, we create things like warm areas, which encourage the bats to breed. We occasionally put incubators, which help support temperature and save energy for the bats. They don't need to keep themselves warm. We can do that artificially with incubators. And what's been done over time is this is applied research. So we do the research to see what the bats need, and then we apply it into practical conservation, and something that's continually monitored over time. And this summer, we've been doing a project looking at bats' responses to temperature within some of our reserves, and seeing the importance of how temperature can affect colonies. And this is time-lapse images throughout the day in a colony. And you can see at 6 a.m. in the morning, the colony is roosting inside this nice hot roostatic space. 9 a.m, they're starting to spread out a little bit more. By 12 p.m, all the clusters have separated. The bats are roosting individually. And in the afternoon, this was a particularly warm day, the attic is absent because it's got too warm here for the bats. So it's really important, as well as providing hot spaces, we consider about providing cool areas as well. And we see how these roofs change over time as climate changes as well. And as well as the hot spaces, we can create cold areas. So in the same roost downstairs, and we've created a cold area here. This is a tunnel system. It's a hibernaculum where the bats can go in winter or in summer, and they can save energy by dropping their body temperature and conserving energy inside. And as I turn the corner here, you will hopefully see a colony of bats roosting in the top of this cold room, and they're in deep hibernation at this point. This was taken in winter last year. And I think the great thing about the Vincent Wildlife Trust is everything is evidence-based. It's based on science, it's based on research, and we can publish some of this information. And last year, the team published a paper all about roost management of horseshoe bats. And if we actively manage them, we can increase breeding success, and the populations will grow quicker than at sites that are unmanaged. And this research is sometimes combined with PhDs. So we actively have a PhD program, and every other year we support a PhD student, and we supply some of the funding for the PhD. We have 3 currently ongoing: Kieran, that's been working on barber stells, Katie working on automated tracking systems, and Charlotte, who's just started her PhD, looking at moving bats through the landscape. And we also work with lots of other MSc and PhD students that perhaps we're not funding, but we're helping to promote and work in collaboration with them. And for me, working full time on bat conservation, it's like a dream. I wake up every day now, and rather than 50% of my time being spent on conservation, 100% of my time is spent on bat conservation. And I realize I'm incredibly lucky in being able to do that. And lots of people ask about what they can do, and you don't quite need to be as extreme and put 100% of your effort into bat conservation, but just do what you can do, basically, and join other groups, collaborate with people. But I think more importantly is educate and embrace other people, try to be a catalyst for people. And just think about when I was, 6, 7 years old, if I was ignored and my teachers weren't helpful, my parents weren't helpful, my friends weren't interested in bats, I probably would have not developed the interest I have in bats. And when you go out to give talks and you work with people, I think it's really important that you consider the individual. And there might be somebody sat in that classroom. And if you think about all the greats in bat conservation, people like Merlin Tuttle and Brock Fenton, at some point in time, they were somebody's student. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that. And also that we practice what we preach. If we're telling people to go out and do conservation, and let's make sure that we are doing it at home as well. And I'm very happy to share my home with a colony of brown long-eared bats. And I've been actively putting my conservation practices in place at home. And I now have a really nice colony of brown long-eared bats. I've created more space within my attic so they can move around. I've created a pond which they can drink from, which wasn't here when we first moved in. And I've planted lots of night flowering plants which encourage lots of insects, which in turn encourages the bats, as well as putting bat boxes up and promoting conservation on my own little patch at home. And I think that's enough of me talking for a little while, and I'd just like to say thank you for listening. I think we've got 10 minutes for questions or discussion, but hopefully some of that was interesting.
Thank you very much.
I have a question. Should I use the email or this speaking?
Please, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. Very inspiring. And you've raised a very interesting point. I would love to modify my house and maybe put up some bat boxes or something, just get the environment more attractive to them. I saw some very beautiful bat boxes in the Kruger Park? That's the one question. And the other question is, I'd love to give myself a treat. And where would you advise, if I could go anywhere in the world, South Africa included, but actually it's more exciting overseas, where there's forest. You mentioned something about mist cloud forests and get my hands dirty. What I'm saying is I'd love to get more involved with bats now. I'm open to anything. Thank you.
Good, thank you, Mark. Yeah, I think when it comes to what you can do at home, things like bat boxes are great. You can put a shelter up for bats, but also just modifying your home. If you can allow bats to move in your home and live with you, then I can promise you it's fascinating to have your own colony of bats to work with. And bat boxes, there's lots of different designs, lots of different areas. I would probably encourage you to purchase or read the Bat House Handbook, which Merlin Tuttle's Bat Conservation produced, which is brilliant. It gives a good overview of bat boxes around the world. And I'm sure you'll get some really good ideas that will work for you and the bats that you have locally. As far as getting involved, then yes, there's a number of organisations that always need help. And I think sometimes it's just trying to put yourself out there a little bit, contact as many people as you can, and try to get involved with some of these conservation groups. And if you can actively get involved practically, then that's brilliant, but also just supporting some of the work that they're doing financially or volunteering your time is a brilliant way to do it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel. And I think everyone in the audience agrees that that was an excellent and captivating presentation. I think if we have any more questions, you can unmute yourself and ask the question to Daniel, or you can put the question in the chat and then I'll be able to read it out. Thank you very much, Daniel. One of the things that you did highlight was the importance of conservation, which is backed by scientific research. I think that is something that is very important. Maybe you can just mention about, from your experience, what has changed over time in bat conservation, having worked in Trinidad and Tobago, Zambia, and Thailand.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about it. I've seen a huge change in the number of people that are interested in bats, which is brilliant. The bat community is growing, which is great. I think social media has been a brilliant platform to join people together. And I've been really fortunate to work with a huge amount of people and different organisations. And I think that collaboration is really important, and getting perhaps research and conservation, scientists and conservation together as well. I think it's really important if people are going to countries to do research, they need to consider conservation wherever they go. And I think sometimes that is missed. Some people go to different countries and they apply really good research, sound research and science, but they forget about the conservation element within that country. And Trinidad was a little bit like that you could read lots of scientific papers, lots of research about Trinidad, but perhaps practical conservation on the ground was missing. And that's probably more difficult to develop for lots of countries because they don't have this. We're quite unique in the UK, not completely unique, but quite unique that we've got lots of volunteers and lots of people that are willing to engage in bats, and that's not the same in other countries.
Thank you very much. I see Dominic Kimani, as you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel. That was really captivating. I am from Kenya and I work for a wind farm. And I can already tell you that very little information on how bats are affected by wind farms. And I would really want to get in touch because I'm I'm an ornithologist by profession, but we know very little about bats, and that is an area that I'm really keen to do proper monitoring, and I've already convinced our company how we can do proper monitoring because these are amazing animals that we need to conserve. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a subject, Dominic, that bats and wind turbines. It's been really well studied in some countries, not so much in others, but we know that there's severe impacts that wind turbines can have on certain bat populations and certain bat species as well. So there's a wealth of information. Happy to point you into in the direction of lots of resources for that, and hopefully you can research that further and find some effective conservation for wind turbines. But yeah, perhaps drop me an email, and happy to put you in touch with people.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, maybe Daniel, quickly, maybe you can also respond to 2 questions in the chat, and then I'll give Mark a chance to ask through the mic. There's a question: is there a specific reason the Christmas Island bat became extinct, and also are bats farmed?
Yeah, is there a specific reason the Christmas Island bat became extinct? There's a book published all about the Christmas Island bat, which was published after it became extinct, and it gives a brilliant narrative. It's quite difficult to read. It's very sad, and the fact that when it became extinct, that species became more popular than when it was alive speaks volumes. But there's lots of reasons, and I think it was a combination of things that made it become extinct, and a little bit that it was too late to do anything about it. By the time that the permissions and the authorities and everybody realized what was happening, it was too late. And I think that's why we need to consider some of these more common species, perhaps not as enigmatic species. We need to consider them as well. So I see that second question there, Christopher. Are bats farmed? Not
Yes.
to my knowledge. Are bats farmed? Often what's happening is there's this trade in taxidermy bats, these dried bats. I showed a picture of a painted bat in a frame. And when you challenge some of the sellers, they will say that the bats are farmed and they're sustainably sourced. But bats don't live like that. They're incredibly difficult to keep. They need a lot of space, and to keep them in a healthy way, it'd be incredibly difficult, especially for the insectivorous bats. So, you know, to my knowledge, bats aren't farmed anywhere. And for people that are doing the taxidermy that say, yes, we're farming them, I would be really suspicious, because there's no evidence that they are. And they breed so slowly that, you know, imagine the space you would need to try and farm these animals for taxidermy. So no, I don't think bats are farmed.
Thank you. Maybe on account of time, we'll sneak in one more question from Mark. You could kindly unmute yourself. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So some time ago, I've been getting more and more interested in wildlife and biodiversity, and it seems everywhere there are these awesome courses on birding. You can go out into the bush and there's experts out there, and you can book 3 or 4 days away with them. Perhaps you guys would consider something with bats to actually learn bat handling, like a weekend course in Kruger or something. It would be absolutely wonderful to really immerse oneself in this world, but with experts who know the thing. I mean, after the birding course, I'm now 100% baptized, I'm converted, I'm hooked. I love them and I'm fanatic. The next thing is bats. I would love to be with experts. Maybe it's worthwhile to consider something like this. I mean, there's birding courses behind every tree, but not one on bats. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Mark. It's a very good point. And there are courses available in the UK, North America. There's quite a few courses available, but some areas in the world, it's been incredibly difficult to offer them types of courses. And I think what we need to do is to be training the trainers. We need people to be able to go out and work in some of these areas. And there's lots of organizations. If you get in touch with the bat community, especially with Bats Without Borders, and they'll be able to point you in the direction of opportunities. But I would love to see more training going on and more training people to be able to go out and train others, I think, is where we need to build capacity.
Thank you. just like to say one thing. I would love to be one of those. I used to do. I was very lucky when I was young. I went out into the Amazon and I got involved with the WWF, and we stayed in this little camp. It's forever reached me, and I did talks on it and all this kind of stuff. I would love to do it with bats. Even go out and do a course and be the person who does that. It's like I want to immerse myself into that world, but from where I am in Cape Town, it feels like a desert. I've started managing to reach a few people. It'd be really incredible if you guys could help, and I will talk with Bats Without Borders. Maybe it could start in Natal, I think. I don't know. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, so just to comment on Mark's the question from Mark, recently Bats Without Borders organized a training for people on how to establish bat groups. So I know that right now there's a group in Cape Town, a group of about 4 who are trying to come up with a bat group in Cape Town. So that's something you can look up to. But also, I know that there are also other groups in South Africa on bats. Like in the chat, you can check. I think Elena Richardson has just put up that they can contact Bats KZN. Also, that is another group you can contact to just help who are trying to raise awareness on bats in Southern Africa. So I think with that, I think would like to thank Daniel Hargreaves for your time and the excellent presentation, and also everyone for your time to be able to join the webinar for today. This was the last webinar for 2023. We see you again in 2024 in March, the last Wednesday of March, as we start the series for 2024. Thank you very much and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.